Hannah Fletcher was 9 months gone with child and entirely alone in the world when she climbed the last cold mile up Red Wing Creek in the failing light of a January afternoon, following the one thread of wood smoke she had seen from the valley, praying it led to a soul with a warm fire and a Christian heart, for she had neither strength nor time left to find another. She was 20 years old. She had walked out of the town of Bethel 4 days before with a carpet bag and $11, and the whole weight of the child inside her, cast out of her own father's house for a sin the world had decided was hers alone to carry. And she had spent those 4 days working her way up into the mountains on a rumor of a settlement that did not, it turned out, exist. And now the $11 were gone and the carpet bag was gone, sold for a night's lodging and a meal, and there was nothing left of Hannah Fletcher's whole life but the clothes gone thin on her back, the child pressing hard and low against her spine, and the smoke rising far up the frozen creek from someone's unseen fire. The pains had started that morning. She had known them for what they were. She was a farm girl. She had helped at enough birthings to know, and she had understood, with a terror colder than the snow, that her time had come, out here, alone in the killing white. 4 days from any midwife and a lifetime from anyone who loved her. She thought, as she walked, of the morning her father had cast her out, how he had not shouted. For Ezekiel Fletcher never shouted, but had spoken his judgment in the same cold measured voice he used from the pulpit, quoting the verses about harlots and millstones while his own daughter stood before him grieving the man she'd meant to marry, and how her mother, cowed and long since broken to her husband's will, had not lifted her eyes from her mending, nor said a single word in her only child's defense. She thought of the door closing behind her. She thought of the 4 hard days since, the barns she'd slept in, the meals she'd begged, the men she'd had to walk wary of, the $11 trickling away to nothing. And she thought above all that none of it mattered now, not the shame, nor the cold, nor the hunger, if only she could get the child inside her born living. For that child was the last of Jesse she had left in all the world, and she would crawl to the ends of the earth on her hands to see it safe. So she had turned toward the smoke and walked, 1 foot before the other, stopping when the pains gripped her to bend double over her great belly and breathe until they passed, and then walking on because the only thing worse than walking was stopping. For to stop was to lie down in the snow and let it take her and the babe both, and Hannah Fletcher had lost her mother's love and her betrothed and her father and her good name and her whole life this terrible winter, but she had not yet lost the fierce animal will to see her child born living. And it was that will alone that carried her the last cold mile up Red Wing Creek to the cabin at the end of the smoke. It was a snug log place set back among snow-laden pines, 1 gold window glowing, a barn behind, and Hannah made for the door of it with the last of everything she had, and a pain took her 10 feet from the threshold, the hardest yet, doubling her over gasping into the snow, and she went down onto her knees and could not for a moment rise. And then she crawled the last of the way, and she reached up and beat her frozen fist against the rough door, and she cried out, "Please, please, is anyone? I'm having my baby. Please, in God's name, open the door." The door opened. Warmth and light fell out into the blue dusk, and a man stood in it, a strong, quiet, chestnut-bearded man with warm, dark eyes, gone wide with astonishment, taking in the sight of a hugely pregnant girl on her knees in the snow at his doorstep, and Hannah looked up at him and got out, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," to "there was nowhere else," before the next pain took the words from her, and the man was down on his knees in the snow beside her in an instant, his big hands gentle at her shoulders. "Don't be sorry," he said. Don't you dare be sorry. Come inside. Come on. I've got you. How far apart are the pains?" And Hannah, gasping, told him close, very close, and the man's face went grim and set and kind, all at once, and he lifted her clean up out of the snow into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all, great belly and all, and carried her over his threshold into the warm firelit cabin, and that was how Hannah Fletcher came to the home of Caleb Morrow. On her knees in the snow with another man's child coming, and was carried in out of the cold like something precious instead of something shameful, for the first time in the whole long winter of her disgrace. His name was Caleb Morrow, and he lived alone up Redwing Creek and ran a small trap line and a few cattle, and he had not the first idea how to birth a baby. But he had birthed a great many calves and foals and lambs, and he knew that a body in labor mostly wants to be kept warm and calm and not left alone, and so he did those things. He built the fire high. He warmed water and tore clean linen, and settled the frightened girl on the bed by the hearth, and told her steady that he'd fetch the nearest midwife if there were time, but he did not think there was. So it would be the two of them, and was she willing to let a rough stranger help her through it, for there was no help for it otherwise. And Hannah, gripped by a pain that arched her off the bed, gasped that she was willing, that she was grateful, that she'd thought she would die alone in the snow. And here at least was a warm fire and a kind voice, and Caleb Morrow took her hand and let her crush it and said, "You're not going to die. And neither's the babe, not on my watch. I've pulled 100 living things into this cold world and not lost many, and I don't mean to start with you. Now, when the next one comes, you bear down, and I'll be right here, and we'll do this together." And they did. It was a long, hard night, the longest of Hannah's life, and there were hours in the black middle of it when both of them were afraid, though Caleb never let it show in his voice, only in his eyes, and near dawn, when Hannah had no strength left and thought she could not do the thing that had to be done, Caleb Morrow put his forehead down close to hers and said, fierce and low, "You've come 4 days through the snow to get this child born safe. You didn't lie down and quit in the drifts, and you're not going to quit now. 10 feet from the finish. One more, Hannah, give me one more. I've got you." And Hannah Fletcher found, somewhere past the end of herself, one more, and gave it, and in the gray first light of that January morning, a baby's thin, furious cry rose up in the warm cabin on Redwing Creek, and Caleb Morrow, weeping without knowing it, lifted a tiny squalling red daughter into the firelight and wrapped her in warmed linen and laid her on her mother's heaving chest, and said in a voice that shook, there she is. You did it. She's perfect, Hannah. She's alive and whole and perfect, and so are you." There had been a moment, in the worst of it, that neither of them ever forgot. The baby had come turned wrong, and for a space of minutes in the deepest dark of the night Caleb had had to do with his big, careful hands what a midwife would have done, working slow and steady while Hannah bore the pain of it and trusted him, a stranger, with her life and her child's both, because there was no one else and no other way. And when the babe had at last come right and the danger past, Hannah had looked up at him gasping and said, "Why? Why are you so gentle? You don't even know me." And Caleb, his hands shaking now that the worst was over, had said, "Because somebody ought to have been gentle with my mother, the night she had me alone and afraid, and nobody was. I've thought on it my whole life. I reckon I'm being gentle with you the way I always wished somebody'd been with her." And Hannah had wept then, in the middle of her labor, not from the pain, but from the sheer unlooked-for tenderness of it, and something had passed between them in that firelit dark that no ordinary meeting could ever have forged. The particular bond of two people who have fought together through a long night for a single small life and won. Hannah looked down at the small, furious miracle on her breast, the daughter she had carried through disgrace and exile and 4 days of snow, and she wept, and she looked up at the exhausted stranger who had brought her child living into the world with his own 2 hands, and she could not find a single word big enough, so she said none, and Caleb understood. They were not entirely without neighbors, for all the creek was lonesome, and when the storm broke 2 days on, Caleb rode down to fetch the nearest woman, a stout, warm-hearted old midwife named Bet, who lived an hour down the valley and had helped half the babies in that country into the world. Bet came up and looked over mother and child with her practiced hands and pronounced them both sound as bells, and clucked over Caleb's rough good work at the birthing, and stayed some days to see Hannah through the first hard weeks of her lying in, cooking and washing and teaching the young mother the 1,000 small arts of tending a newborn. And Bet, who had eyes in her head and had birthed enough babies to count on no fingers the months from a wedding to a first child, understood the whole shape of things inside a day, and said not one word about it, then or ever, for Bet held that a baby's business was between the baby and the Almighty, and no concern of gossips. And she took one look at how Caleb Morrow cradled that child and made up her mind that whatever the parish book said, it said the truth as far as it mattered. She became Hannah's first friend in that new country, and a fierce one, and it was Bet, later, who would stand at the cabin door with a rolling pin and a face like thunder the day the men from Bethel came, though it did not in the end. Come to rolling pins. You've landed soft, girl, softer than you know, the old woman told Hannah once, watching Caleb walk the fussing baby by the fire. I've caught 400 babies and buried a fair number of the mothers, and I've seen every kind of man there is. That one's the rarest kind. You hold on to him. I mean to, Hannah said. Good, said Bet, see that you do. She had thought, once she was mended, that he would turn her out. She had braced herself for it through the days of her recovering, waiting for the moment his kindness would reach its natural limit. For she knew what she was in the eyes of the world, an unwed mother, a fallen woman, a scandal with a bastard babe, and she knew what such women could expect, having learned it hard in her own father's house. She told Caleb her story, because she owed him the truth of what he'd taken in, how she had been betrothed, honestly and before God, to a young man named Jesse, a good man, a miner, and how they had been 3 weeks from their wedding when the shaft flooded and took him and 11 others down in the dark, and how she had learned she was carrying his child a fortnight after they buried what the water gave back of him, and how her father, Ezekiel Fletcher, deacon of the church at Bethel, a hard righteous man who had never in his life let mercy trouble his principles, had looked at his pregnant, unwed daughter and seen not a grieving girl who'd lost the man she loved, but a stain upon his good name, and had cast her out into the winter with $11 and a quotation of Scripture, telling her she and her sin were no longer welcome under a godly roof, and that she'd best go where no one knew the Fletcher name. So there it is, Hannah finished, lo, not meeting his eyes, the sleeping baby in the crook of her arm. That's what you've taken into your house. A ruined girl and a fatherless child. I'll not blame you to want us gone the moment I can travel. I'll be grateful the whole of my life for what you did, birthing her, saving us. But you needn't take on our shame. No one would ask it of you. Caleb Morrow was quiet a long moment, and then he said a thing she did not expect. Do you know what I was, Hannah, before I was a man with a cabin and a trap line? He turned a piece of kindling in his big hands, staring at the fire. I was a bastard. That's the word for it, the one the good folk use. My mother was a servant girl, and my father was the man she served. And he never claimed me, never gave me his name, nor a nickel, nor a kind word, and I grew up in a town not unlike your Bethel, where every soul knew whose shame I was. And I wore it every day of my childhood like a brand on my face. The name-calling, the mothers pulling their children back, the preacher's sermons that always seemed to have me in mind. I was 6 years old the first time another child told me I had no right to be alive, and I believed it, God help me, for a good many years. He set the kindling down. My mother died when I was 10, worn out, and I was raised on by whoever would feed me for the work I could do. And I got out of that town the first day I was big enough to, and I came up into these mountains where a man's judged by what he does and not by how he came into the world, and I made myself a life. But I never forgot it. I never once forgot what it is to be a child that the world has decided is a sin before he's drawn a full breath. He looked up at her then, and his warm eyes were wet. So when you tell me you've a fatherless child and you brace for me to throw you out over the shame of it, Hannah, you've come to the one door in this whole hard country that will never ever do that. For I know what's waiting for that little girl out there. The whispers. The word bastard following her all her days like it followed me. And I'll not have it. I will not have it. Hannah stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying marry me, Caleb said. Not out of pity, and not out of duty for having birthed her, though I'll not deny I've come to. He stopped, gruff. I'm saying let me give that child a name. My name. Let me stand up in the church at Bethel or anywhere else and swear before God and every soul that Nora, for Hannah had named the babe Nora for her own dead mother, that Nora is my daughter, mine, born in my house, Morrow, wanted and claimed and legitimate, with a father who'll never once let her wonder if she'd a right to be alive. No one need ever know different. No one living was at that birthing but the two of us. Let the world believe she's mine, for she can be, if you'll have me. She can be mine in every way that a name and a lifetime of loving can make her, which is every way that matters. That's what I'm offering you, Hannah Fletcher. Not charity. The one gift I most wanted in all the world when I was small and never got. Let me give it to your girl. Let me be her father. Let me name the child my own. And Hannah Fletcher, who had been cast out by her own father for the shame of the child in her arms, sat in a warm cabin on Red Wing Creek and heard a stranger offer to take that same child and call her his, and shield her from the world's cruelty with his own name and his own body for the whole of her life, and she understood that she was in the presence of a grace so much larger than the cramped, hard righteousness she'd been raised on that the two could scarcely be called by the same religion. She looked down at little Nora sleeping, unknowing, on the very edge of a lifetime of shame or a lifetime of belonging, depending on what her mother said next. And she looked up at Caleb Morrow. "You'd do that," she whispered. "You'd carry a stranger's child as your own and never let her feel the difference, because you know what the difference costs." "I know exactly what it costs," Caleb said, "down to the penny. That's why." "Then yes," Hannah said, and her voice broke on it. "Yes, Caleb Morrow, be her father. God knows she'll never find a better one, for there's not a better one living." They were married within the month, when Hannah was strong enough to travel down to the little church in the next valley over. Not Bethel, never Bethel. And Caleb Morrow stood up before God and the parson and swore to love and keep Hannah Fletcher and her daughter, and had the child entered in the parish book as Nora Morrow his own, and no one there knew or asked otherwise. And they went home up Red Wing Creek and became, quietly, a family. Hannah watched Caleb with the baby in those first weeks with a wonder that never wore off. The great rough trapper, cradling the tiny girl against his chest by the hour, walking her through the cold nights, learning the particular songs that soothed her, gazing down at her with a fierce protective tenderness that no true father by blood could have exceeded. For Caleb Morrow was fathering not only Nora, but the small nameless boy he himself had been, and pouring into this child every scrap of the belonging he had gone without. And Hannah, who had come to that cabin certain she was ruined past redemption, felt the shame she'd carried begin, week by week, to loosen and lift, thawed out by the warmth of a man who had looked at the worst the world could say of her, and answered it with his name. Love grew between them slow and sure, as it does between two people who have each known too much of the world's coldness to mistake its warmth when at last they find it, and by the time the deep snows began to soften, Hannah Morrow loved her husband with a whole and grateful heart, and knew herself loved in return, not for having been rescued, but for her own brave, stubborn self. And the cabin on Red Wing Creek was as happy a home as any in that country. The winter that had begun in such terror settled, for Hannah, into the happiest season of her life. She had feared, in her lowest hours on the road, that she would spend her days a servant grateful for scraps of tolerance. Instead, she found herself a wife cherished, a woman whose thoughts Caleb asked for and listened to, whose small preferences he learned and quietly honored. He built a cradle for Nora through the long evenings, carving it by firelight, and he made a game of trying to guess which of his foolish songs would settle her when she fussed, and he would walk the floor with the baby against his shoulder in the black cold hours so that Hannah could sleep, telling the drowsing infant long murmured stories of the mountain and the creek and all the good years he meant for her to have. Hannah would wake sometimes and lie still and listen to it, the low rumble of the man's voice and the small snuffling of the child, and think that if her father had wanted to punish her, he had failed past all reckoning, for he had cast her straight into heaven. And there came a night, not long before the thaw, when Nora had at last gone to sleep and Caleb sat down heavy and content by the fire, and Hannah came and sat beside him, closer than she ever had, and leaned her head against his shoulder, and neither of them said a word for a long while, and then Caleb turned and pressed his lips to her hair, careful, questioning, and Hannah lifted her face. And the last distance between them closed at last, sweet and unhurried, two people who had each been sure they were meant to be alone, finding out together that they were not. "I never thought I'd have this," Caleb said, low, after, "a wife, a child, a warm house with folk in it that are mine. I'd made my peace with the cold near about. And then you came crawling up my creek in the snow and wrecked 40 years of making peace with it in a single night." "I'm sorry," Hannah said, smiling against him. "No," said Caleb. "Don't you dare be sorry. I told you that the first minute, and I mean it more now. Best thing that ever came to this door. It could not stay hidden forever, of course. Word travels even up a frozen creek, and in time the word reached Bethel that the cast-out Fletcher girl had not died in the snow as her father had let the town assume, but had married a landowner up Red Wing Creek and borne her child in wedlock, and was living, by all accounts, respectable and content. And this news, curiously, did not please Ezekiel Fletcher. It enraged him. For a daughter dead in the snow was a tragedy a righteous man could mourn and be pitied for, but a daughter thriving, wed, a mother happy, a daughter who had found grace and belonging in the very disgrace he had cast her into, that was a standing rebuke to Ezekiel Fletcher's every hard principle. a living proof that the mercy he had denied his own child had been waiting for her elsewhere, and the deacon could not abide it. So he came up Red Wing Creek on a cold, bright day at winter's end, in his black coat with his black Bible, and 2 of the church elders with him, to set the matter right in the only way his cramped soul understood, to confront the sin and reclaim the appearance of authority, and remind his daughter and her rescuer just what manner of woman she was and what manner of child she'd borne. He found them all at home, and he did not knock, but came in righteous and cold. And he looked at his daughter with the baby at her breast, and he said, without a word of greeting, "So, you did not die. You compounded your sin instead, and dressed it up in a wedding to hide the shame of it. Does this man know what he's married? Does he know that child is no true-born babe, but the fruit of her name is Nora Morrow," said Caleb, rising, "and she's my daughter, and you'll speak of her with respect in my house, or you'll speak of her outside it." "Your daughter." Ezekiel Fletcher's thin mouth curled. "I know what she is, sir, whatever lie you've entered in a parish book. She's a bastard got on my daughter by a dead miner, and no amount of," and Caleb Morrow crossed the room and stood over the gaunt preacher, and he was not loud, but there was something in his quiet that stopped the man's mouth cold. "Let me tell you what I know, Deacon Fletcher," he said, "since you're so fond of what folk are. I was a bastard. Born one, raised one, branded one, in a town full of godly men just like you who quoted Scripture at a motherless boy and called it righteousness. I know exactly the childhood you've just wished on that sleeping baby with the word you used. So hear me. That child has a father. I am her father. I was there when she drew her first breath. These hands were the first to hold her. My name is the name she'll carry, and I will spend my life and my last breath making certain she never once feels the brand you godly men were so eager to press on me. As for your daughter," he turned, and his voice gentled, and he looked at Hannah. "Your daughter lost the man she loved in a flooded mine 3 weeks before their wedding, and grieved him carrying his child. And you looked at that grieving girl, and saw a stain on your name and threw her into the snow to die with a Bible verse for a coat. You want to talk to me of sin, Deacon? There's the sin. Not a girl who loved a good man and lost him, a father who cast his own child out to freeze rather than suffer his neighbor's whispers. That's the sin in this room, and it isn't hers, and it isn't mine, and it surely isn't that baby's. It's yours. And I'll thank you to take it back down the mountain with you, for it's not welcome at my fire." The cabin was very still. The 2 elders looked at their boots, and Ezekiel Fletcher stood white and rigid, unaccustomed to being answered, unaccustomed to having his righteousness named for the cruelty it was, and for one moment something flickered behind his cold eyes that might, in a softer man, have become shame, or grief, or the beginning of repentance, for he was looking at his daughter, alive and loved and holding his grandchild, everything he had thrown away. But Ezekiel Fletcher had spent 55 years making his heart hard in the name of God, and a heart cannot always soften just because a moment asks it to, and the flicker passed, and he drew himself up. "You have made your bed," he said to Hannah, "cold. I see that you mean to lie in it. Then we have nothing further to say to one another." And he turned to go. "Father," Hannah's voice stopped him at the door. She had risen, the baby in her arms, and she was weeping, but her voice was steady. "I forgive you. I want you to know that. Not because you've asked, you haven't, but because I'll not raise my daughter in a house that keeps a grudge, the way I was raised in a house that kept its righteousness. You threw me out to die, Father, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, though you never meant it so, for it drove me up this creek to the kindest man alive, and I've a life now warmer and truer than anything Bethel ever offered. So I forgive you and I pity you, for you're going home to a cold house and I'm staying in a warm one, and that's a judgment more fitting than any I could wish on you. Goodbye, Father. I hope you find your way to grace before the end. I truly do. And Ezekiel Fletcher looked at his daughter a long moment, and found he had nothing to say to so much mercy. For cruelty always has an answer for cruelty, but never any answer at all for grace, and he went out and down the mountain and out of her life. And if he ever did find his way to a softer heart, Hannah never heard of it, though she prayed for it more than he'd ever have believed. And that was the end of the shadow over Red Wing Creek. Nora Morrow grew up there in the warm cabin, the beloved daughter of Caleb and Hannah Morrow, and she never once in all her childhood heard the word that had haunted her fathers, never wondered if she had a right to be alive, never knew herself as anything but wholly wanted, wholly claimed, wholly her papa's girl, for Caleb kept his vow to the last letter, and loved her so plainly and so fiercely that no soul who saw them together would ever have dreamed she was not his own by blood, and in every way that a name and a lifetime of loving could make her, she was. In time there were more children in the cabin, born to Caleb and Hannah both, and Caleb loved them all exactly the same, no more and no less than Nora, and if the truth of Nora's birth was ever spoken of at all in that family, it was only when she was grown as the story of how her papa had pulled her into the world with his own 2 hands on the coldest night of the year, and named her his own before she'd drawn her second breath, which was the truest and most loving version of the tale, and the only one that ever mattered. For Caleb Morrow had learned young the cruelest thing the world can do to a child, which is to name it a sin and a stranger before it can speak a word in its own defense. And he had spent his whole grown life waiting, though he never knew it until she came crawling to his door through the snow, for the chance to answer that cruelty with its opposite, to take a child the world would have branded and shamed, and name her his own, and shield her with his name and his love from the first cold breath to the last. He had wanted, more than anything, to be given that gift when he was small. He never was. So he had grown up and become the man who gives it. And Hannah Fletcher, cast out to freeze by her own father, had walked 4 days through the snow and up a frozen creek and delivered her fatherless child not into shame but into the arms of the one man in all the world who understood, down to the marrow of him, exactly what that child needed, and gave it to her, freely, gladly, for the whole of both their lives. Some children are born to their fathers. Nora Morrow was chosen by hers, on the coldest night of the year, before she had a name, and there is no deeper way in all this world that a child can ever be loved.